Order. This hearing is fully virtual, and I'm going to address some housekeeping matters. For today's meeting, the chair or staff designated by the chair may mute participants' microphones when they are not under recognition for the purpose of eliminating background noise. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves. If I notice you have not unmuted yourself, I will ask you to do so. And if you still have problems, I'll ask the staff to unmute you. So just indicate by nodding your head and if you need to be unmuted. I remind all witnesses and the members that the 5 o'clock rule still applies. And if you can't see the timer, please email staff and we'll make sure you can know how to get it up on your screen. If there's a technology issue, we will move to the next member until that issue is resolved, and you will retain the balance of your time. You will notice, as I said, a clock on your screen, and it shows you how much time's remaining. At 1 minute, the clock will turn yellow. At 30 seconds remaining, I will gently tap the gavel to remind members that their time is almost expired. When your time has expired and the clock is turned red, I will begin to recognize the next member. In terms of speaking order, we're going to follow the order set forward by House rules, beginning with the chair and the ranking member. Members present at the time the hearing is called to order will be recognized in order of seniority. And finally, members not present at the time the hearing is called to order. And finally, House rules require me to remind you that we have set up an email address to which members can send anything they wish to submit in writing at any of our hearings or markups. And that email is been provided in advance to your staff. So with that, I will bring forward my opening statement. This afternoon, the committee will receive testimony on the defense, environmental restoration programs and accounts. Our 4 witnesses are Mr. Richard Kidd, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Environmental and Energy Resilience, Ms. Amy Borman, Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Army for Environment, Mr. Ohennessen, and I tried to practice that with you yesterday, sir. I hope I got it close. Please correct us when you're testifying. The Deputy Secretary for the Navy and Environment, and Mr. Mark Cordell, Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Environment, Safety, and Infrastructure. We welcome you and we thank you for your service. This is the very first time that the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee has ever held a hearing specifically on environmental restoration or remediation issues within the Department of Defense. I believe it's critically important that this subcommittee be engaged here because environmental cleanup is directly relevant to every single state in our nation and many of our congressional districts that we represent. The impacts of environmental contamination in our communities, whether it be from hazardous chemicals or military munitions, are not partisan issues. This is about the lives, the health, and safety of our service members, their families, and our constituents who live in and around military installations. It is the duty of the Department of Defense and the services to ensure that they are responsible stewards of the land on which they operate. Where contamination has occurred, the department and the services must ensure that those sites are cleaned up in a timely fashion to standards that meet the needs of the local communities. It is our job in Congress to be a partner with DoD by ensuring adequate funding and conducting proper oversight of these cleanup projects. One of my hopes for this hearing is for us to learn how we can better work together, in fact, work smarter in funding remediation projects so we can get these sites cleaned up as swiftly as possible. For some of the topics for today's hearing, I hope we can hear more about how funding is prioritized in the environmental restoration accounts and how the department and the services are using risk-based analysis to respond to contamination in our communities caused by DoD actions. In places where the department is the known source of contamination, how the department is communicating the risks to service members, their families, and the neighboring communities. and ensuring that those who are affected are well aware and consulted. The cost to complete cleanup, DoD caused contamination in military munitions at current and former military facilities, and what constraints exist to speed along the cleanups. The scope of the DoD's PFAS cleanup, where the department is in identifying these possible contamination at DoD installations. These toxic fluorinated forever chemicals, and how far along in CIRCULA process are the services in remediating the PFAS contamination. The discussion of research and development, the work the department is exploring to do its PFAS remediation, and what promising technologies exist to develop PFAS-free firefighting foam. Now, I acknowledge, and we all know, that we're holding this hearing just before the release of the full budget request. And we understand to our testifiers that this may limit your ability to answer certain questions. However, given the tight time frame we have to write this bill, I ask that you be prepared to respond to members and committee staff on any specific budget questions that are asked today immediately after the full budget request has been submitted. With that, I thank you again for appearing before the committee today to discuss these important issues. I will ask you to present your summarized statements in a moment, but first I would like to recognize our ranking member, Mr. Calvert, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chair McCollum. I appreciate you calling this hearing today. There are a few issues more consequential to the quality of life for our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and Guardians than worry-free access to safe and clean drinking water. The Defense Environmental Restoration Program is a critical element in providing both short and long-term remediation on military installations or in the surrounding communities, especially as the chairman mentioned, where PFAS levels were detected in excess of current clean water standards. Given the complexities of this national challenge and the importance of close interagency collaboration with EPA, I look forward to discussion on the details of your approach to identify, investigate, and respond to this presence of PFAS. And I mentioned PFAS especially because it seems to be the overwhelming problem throughout the nation. I would also appreciate an update on the department's efforts to find a replacement for PFAS. As the chairman mentioned, this long-used firefighting foam, I know it's very effective in putting out fires, but obviously it has other problems. My understanding is that the FY20 NDAA requires the department to phase it out in all military installations by October 2024, but perhaps you can tell us whether this timetable can be accelerated if we have hopefully a suitable alternative. I know there's a high level of interest in Congress and the department's efforts to address contamination from other hazardous substances, including unexploded ordnance, discarded military munitions at formerly used defense properties, and BRAC locations throughout the United States. I hope you can similarly update us on these important efforts. Again, I thank the chair and I thank all of you for your appearance today, and I look forward to your testimony. With that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. You and I have worked well on environmental issues for many, many years. Look forward to working with you on this. Mr. Kidd, we would like to ask you for your statement, please.
Chair McCollum, Ranking Member Calvert, other members of the committee, I appreciate the opportunity to be here today and provide a summary of the Department of Defense's Environmental Restoration Program. Thanks to strong and consistent support from Congress, totaling over $45 billion since the inception of this effort, the department has been able to establish and maintain a mature, effective cleanup program. We have made consistent progress across both installation restoration program sites to address cleanup and military munitions response program sites to address unexploded ordnance. Congressional support for the program exceeded $1.6 billion in FY20 and $1.9 billion in FY21. Because of this sustained effort and support, the department has now completed cleanup at over 85% of the total identified sites. Nonetheless, all should understand that cleanup is a long-term endeavor requiring sustained funding and persistent attention. In many cases, some of the hardest to address sites remain, and our estimated cost to complete cleanup exceeds $29 billion. Of increasing interest to all are the challenges related to unregulated or emerging chemicals of concern, particularly including perfluorinated compounds or PFAS. Given the importance being placed on this family of chemicals, I would like to share with you my candid assessment on our efforts after 5 months on the job. First, an overview of the department's PFAS-related cleanup efforts. As of March 31st of this year, the department had identified 698 installations where DoD used or potentially released PFAS. All of these installations have entered the CERCLA process. We have completed the preliminary assessment and site investigation on 129 of these installations. Of these 129, 63 were found to require no further action, while 66 are proceeding to the remedial investigation and feasibility study per the CERCLA process. We expect all of the preliminary assessments, site investigations on all installations to be completed by the first quarter of 2024. The department has also taken quick action to address PFAS chemicals in drinking water, both on and off base, and we are confident that no one is drinking water with PFAS or PFOA above EPA's lifetime health advisory of 70 parts per trillion, where the Department of Defense is the known source. Additionally, the department has a strong internal governance body in the form of the PFAS Task Force and a record of serious engagement on this topic. Second, I would like to share with you my assessment of the challenge that is ahead of us. The rate of progress is defined primarily by the rules that govern our physical world. Physics, chemistry, and science establish the realm of the possible and dictate the parameters within which we work. Based on what we know today and known technologies, frankly, it will be years before we fully define the scope of the problem, and with that definition can reflect it in our budget requests, and after that, probably decades before cleanup is complete. Despite this challenge, opportunities exist for improving what we are currently doing, and I would highlight these to you. The first is to invest in science, challenge the parameters I mentioned above, expand options, and accelerate cleanup. Second is to improve our internal processes. Every month matters. We should apply best management practice and insights from data to reduce DoD internal decision times. We must expand community outreach. Frankly, the most important outreach occurs at the local level, but it's important that senior leaders demonstrate their commitment and lead by example. And I will start this on July 14th when I will represent the department in a public town hall. Finally, we must engage our partner agencies at state and local level. Dependencies on regulators are real. Engagement is critical. Our secretary met with the EPA administrator 2 weeks ago, and during that meeting, they discussed PFAS at length and made it clear to all of us that collaboration is essential and will be the norm between the two agencies going forward. The program is legally and technically complex, but its purpose is simple: to preserve the trust with the American people and protect the environmental bounty of this great land for current and future generations. I am committed to this effort, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Ms. Borman.
Chair McCollum, Ranking Member Calvert, and members of the subcommittee, on behalf of the soldiers, families, and civilians of the United States Army, thank you for the opportunity to address your interest in and answer questions about the Army's Defense Environmental Restoration Account. The Department of the Army's Restoration Program is a mature program managed and executed by a team of soldiers and civilians from across the Army. And I'm proud to report that approximately 91% of our restoration sites have reached response complete milestone. And this occurs when sites complete the proposed remedial action or require no further investigation. The Army's universe of cleanup sites yet to achieve response complete is approximately 1,200, spread across our active and our closed installations. In order to make the most impact, we continually reassess the cleanup program with the intention of addressing the highest risk sites first. At the same time, we're committed to achieving response complete at all of our sites. While the Army is proud of our successes and remains focused on continuous improvement in our cleanup program, we know that cleanup at many of the remaining sites is more complex and requires additional time and/or advanced technology. The Army has been identifying and conducting cleanup at sites since the 1980s and has come a long way. Still, we remain fully aware of the magnitude of our mission and look forward to continued partnership with fellow federal agencies, state regulators, and industry stakeholders to increase the efficiency in our cleanup efforts. In addition, the Army is focused on responding to the challenges of PFAS and is resolute in making substantial investment necessary to continue forward progress. And we thank you for the support you've provided to date. The Army is dedicated to being transparent about our cleanup process with both Congress and the public. To that end, as we complete the analysis of our PFAS investigations, we're taking steps to make our PFAS cleanup process and results more publicly transparent. Our priority remains the health and safety of our service members, their families, Army civilians, and the communities surrounding our installations. We will continue to prioritize and address our sites where risk to human health is the highest. I assure you that the Army is fully committed to addressing our cleanup responsibilities. Thank you for the opportunity to present this testimony and for your continued support of the Army.
Thank you. Mr. Ohanessian, was that even closer?
That is closer, yes.
Would you please say it for everyone? Names are important, and I apologize.
Sure. My name is Karnik Ohanessian. I think that's why most of my subordinates just call me Mr. O, because they can't say it either. Chair McCollum, Ranking Member Calvert, distinguished members of the subcommittee, I am Karnik Ohanessian, and I'm the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Environment. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the Department of the Navy's Environmental Restoration Program. The Department of the Navy's Environmental Restoration Program is a mature program with a well-established record of protecting human health and the environment through short and long-term response actions taken over the past 3 decades. We are proud of the substantial progress and many successes we have made at the department's more than 4,000 environmental restoration program sites. We have achieved the response complete milestone for 83% of our sites. The remaining sites are our most challenging sites and will require additional time to achieve final remedies, address new and emerging chemicals of concern, and complete long-term remedies that are in progress. Per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS, are at the forefront of the chemicals of emerging concern across the nation. The department is implementing a comprehensive strategy to manage and address the known or potential releases of PFAS from our activities on Navy and Marine Corps installations and facilities nationwide. We are committed to taking proactive action to identify and mitigate the impacts of PFAS releases to human health and the environment within the framework of the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act. The Department of the Navy remains committed to being good stewards of the environment while advancing our mission to defend and protect this great nation. I thank the leadership and membership of the subcommittee for your attention, interest, and ongoing support to the Department of the Navy's Environmental Restoration Program, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you. And I want to thank you, Mr. Cornell, for meeting with me yesterday too and giving me some more background. Mr. Cornell.
Thank you very much. So Chair McCollum, Ranking Member Calvert, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss the Department of the Air Force Environmental Restoration or Cleanup Program and its funding accounts. The department's mature cleanup program focuses on airmen, guardians, families, and surrounding communities by reducing risk to human health and the environment due to our activities. For installation restoration, our first priority is to protect people by quickly taking action to ensure there is no pathway between hazardous substances, pollutants, or contaminants and a human receptor. Once that is completed, we focus on taking a risk-based approach to addressing the long-term impacts to groundwater, soil, and surface water under the direction and authorities of the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, or CERCLA. The Department of the Air Force has 8,338 sites and can report that 6,555 or 79% of those sites are in the response complete phase of CERCLA, with the remaining 1,783 installation and munitions restoration sites still in the cleanup or investigation phases. Over the last 3 years, we've received $456 million in added funds from Congress, and I'd like to thank you for your support. Our responses in all cases are based on the overall relative risk at individual sites. We rank all sites as either high, medium, or low risk based on the toxicity of the contaminants, the likelihood, speed, and impacts of the contaminants migrating, and whether the pathways for contaminants to reach human and ecological receptors are there. We recognize the CERCLA process can confuse and concern our communities, and accordingly, we have a robust program of transparent interaction with stakeholders that range from formal restoration advisory boards to ad hoc community action meetings, to public-facing websites, to installation commander interactions. We are committed to providing stakeholders with validated and timely information on our cleanup activities. Although our program covers a myriad of contaminants, we realize that PFAS, and particularly PFOA and PFOS, are a major concern across the nation. To date, the department has spent $685 million on PFOA and PFOS, is providing mitigation at 33 installations, has completed all 203 CERCLA preliminary assessments, has completed 38 site inspections, and awarded 47 remedial investigation contracts. We've ceased using all firefighting foam for training, treat all real-world use as if it were a hazardous spill, and have retrofitted all our fire vehicles with firefighting foam for training that is lower, that has no PFOS and trace PFOA. We have been and will continue to be as proactive as possible in addressing this national concern. The Department of the Air Force is committed to responsible environmental management, which includes assuring our airmen, guardians, families, and surrounding communities are protected. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. We'll begin with some questions, and I know my colleagues are going to have some really great ones for you. So I'm going to just kind of go back in a general overview on a few things with you. The defense restoration accounts include funding for installation restoration programs, and that's what's used for the cleanup of contaminated from hazardous substances. And then the military munitions response, which is used for the cleanup of munitions. And so would you take a second, and I think maybe this might be most appropriate for you, Mr. Kidd. How is the environmental restoration funding divided and prioritized between the restoration program and the military munitions response program? How is that division made?
So, ma'am, the division is based on ground up priorities developed by the services. Essentially, we have approximately 2.5 times the amount of funds going to the installation restoration sites as we do to the military munitions response program sites.
And the reason for that is?
Ma'am, it's based on the assessed risk. We use 2 different risk categories based on the site at hand. For the installation response sites, we use the relative risk site evaluation process, which Mr. Carell defined rather well. The nature and the extent of the contaminant or the source, the migration pathway, and then the potential impacts on human or ecological receptors. For the munition response program site, the prioritization is based on protocols defined by explosive hazard, whether or not there could be chemical warfare material, and the risk to human health and the environment. Much of the determination is based on the proximity to population centers, and many of the munitions response sites are further away from population centers than some of our installation response program sites.
So would you say, would it be a fair statement to say with emerging contaminants such as PFAS, it has added to the prioritization in the accounts that you're funding with the installation restoration program?
So ma'am, thanks.
Before.
Ma'am, thanks to the support of Congress, we have been able to address the emerging challenges from PFAS without having to reallocate funds between any of the other accounts.
The department has previously estimated that it needs $29 billion to complete pending environmental restoration projects. How does that long-term price tag of cleanup inform the budget request on an annual basis?
Ma'am, that figure is correct. We had a cost to complete figure in 2020 of a little more than 29 billion. We spent 1.6 billion in 2020, and the figure stayed about the same at 29.5 billion. So cost to complete is an issue that we work to address, and part of the increase in the cost to complete is based upon what we learn as we do site assessments and investigation.
So does that $29 billion estimate include what you think might be the cost for the PFAS contamination? Is that included in that amount?
Ma'am, it does for now. We estimate that the cost to complete PFAS right now is $2.1 billion. That number will certainly go up over time as we understand the parameters of the challenge that is ahead of us.
There's been a lot of discussion in this committee about what we need to do to improve our shipyards, to build them for resilience and that. And I had a great conversation, thank you, Mr. O, about shipyards, and he's been thinking ahead about what will be involved because we'll be disturbing and removing a lot of contaminants. Have you included, or will you be looking at including, if it's in infrastructure bills, the cost of remediation that will be incurred when we do shipyards, not only the physical shipyard on land, but any disruption with the soils and the water underneath? Is that I'm assuming that that's probably not included in anything because we haven't moved forward on working on any of those projects, or are you planning ahead?
Thank you. Where we know what the presence and occurrence of PFAS is, we have accounted for that in our cost to complete under the environmental restoration program. Should the work progress for shipyard infrastructure optimization, and then we come across additional occurrences that we're not aware of, then we will determine how to address that. If it's cleanup, it will probably stay in the environmental restoration program, but it's hard for me to answer where they might end up if that's not where they end up. But I don't know the amount that it's going to be either. But what we know is in the environmental restoration program, and what we encounter, if we encounter something new, we will address that appropriately.
Thank you very much, members. I just wanted to get some of the boring stuff out of the way so you can ask all the great questions. So, Mr. Calvert.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to stay on PFAS for a while. Seems that that's a common concern around the country. And as I noted in my opening statement, last year the committee addressed its ongoing concern about the prevalence of PFAS contamination on current and former military installations, and we continue to support groundwater remediation activities undertaken by the department. First, I'd like to get a written response to this because I'm sure that there's a lot being done on this, but what are the DoD and the services doing to stop the continuing spread of PFAS from these military bases? And if you can get back to me on that, I would appreciate it. But right now, I want to get into what we do to extract PFAS contamination groundwater by pumping and then treating, which is the common methodology that has been used over the years. Above ground, it's very expensive, as you all know, and very time consuming. As the witnesses are aware, there's commercially available alternatives to pumping and treating contaminated groundwater that are proven to safely contain PFAS within the aquifer and eliminate the spread. What innovative technologies has DoD and the services identified that can remediate PFAS contaminated groundwater either within the aquifer or once pumped out of the aquifer? I guess that's for anyone who wants to take that on.
I'll take that. Sir, thank you for that question. As I noted in my opening remarks, investing in technology is perhaps one of the best ways to challenge the physical parameters that we work under and to accelerate cleanup. We have a variety of programs in the department that are intended to bring emerging technologies to maturity. These are the CERTIP and ESTCP programs. We have invested over the years in terms of just the treatment. We have a total of 83 projects with about $53 million worth of investment in treatment efforts across the department. These include electrocatalytic and catalytic approaches, in-ground bioaugmentation, and chemical oxidation, and other technologies as well. If the firms that you mentioned have a mature commercialized technology that is ready to use today, they have a couple of different pathways to deploy that. First is to talk to the remediation companies that get the contracts from the department. The second is to talk to the services that are actually doing the cleanup. If it is not a mature technology, please refer them to me and I will give them the opportunity to engage in either the CERTIP or the ESTCP program.
Well, I'll do that. I've been somewhat frustrated over the years because it seems that, the culture is to continue to do what you've been doing over the years, pump and treat. And as you know, the molecule in PFAS is hard to get rid of, even if it goes into a landfill or et cetera. So containing this is extremely important. And as you mentioned, $27 billion to complete pending environmental restoration projects. Does that include the expected cost of cleaning up all these PFAS contamination sites across the country?
Sir, our anticipated cost to complete is a little more than 29 billion right now. It includes the known estimates for PFAS cleanup. We anticipate the total cost for PFAS will increase over time.
How do you prioritize those sites? I'm kind of curious. These DoD installations where, say, I'll just stick with PFAS for a moment. How do you prioritize which sites get cleaned up first and so forth?
Sir, we work within the CERCLA process and we use the relative risk site evaluation process to prioritize based on risk. So generally the highest risk first. We determine risk by the nature and extent of the contamination, the likelihood that or pathway that it will migrate, and then the potential impacts that it could have on human or ecological receptors. We can give you a more detailed briefing as to how we affect that prioritization.
Yeah. And the reason I bring that up is that obviously if you have PFAS in a remote, a rural area versus in a population, high population center, like for instance in Southern California, and we're very dependent upon aquifers for our water supply. I would hope that those sites would be given priority, and I would imagine that throughout the country. Is that correct?
Sir, I don't want to get it in front of our services and our environmental specialists on the ground who are actually doing the work to prioritize the sites, but I would generally agree with your characterization, yes.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll yield back for the moment.
Thank you. I don't have I have one DoD site that's not PFAS where I have a municipal treatment center, and I have 2 municipalities that are having to treat their water for PFAS, and I've been there. So this is something that's near and dear to me to get this right, Mr. Calvert. So thank you for your questions. Ms. Capter, you're recognized.
Holding is really important, and
Ms. Capter, your sound cut out and you're on mute again. You want to try speaking again?
bouncing back. All right, how's that?
That's pretty good. The volume's kind of soft if you want to speak a little louder.
All right. There we go. All right, thank you, Madam Chair, very much for this important hearing, and the fact that it's a first ever is a real credit to you as chair. Thank you very much, and thank the ranking member as well. I'm going to become parochial and speak about the Great Lakes. Thank our very dedicated witnesses for testifying today. I'm interested in whether the department has a map showing the various impingements in the Great Lakes region. Let me take you right down to where I represented the Two-State River over decades ago. We worked at the highest levels of the department. They sent a helicopter to do mapping of the region because we have unexploded ordnance related to the use of Camp Perry during World War II and thereafter for a shooting range. And we have rivers that have been stopped up because of shells that have now been covered with sediment, 5 millimeter up to 150 millimeters, some with chemicals inside. The last I knew, the department pretty much never came back after they created a database. I'd sure like to see what's in it, and to get a plan for remediation, because all of our fishing charter boat operations have now stopped on that river, the Two-Saint River, because of the silting up and the inability of us to solve the defense cleanup problem in that area. And the plume of shells extends way out into Lake Erie toward the Lake Erie Islands. So I wanted to get your commitment to help me figure out what to do next on this very important area. I also wanted to ask you how DOD prioritizes the cleanup of your installations where PFAS has been confirmed. For example, in light of the health risks posed by PFAS, shouldn't the department focus on installations near population centers? Like, for example, we have a Toledo 180th Fighter Wing, that's Army Air, or Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in the western half of Ohio. If they, in fact, are impacted, but close to population centers, is the population density a factor in your decisions on what to prioritize?
You got all these?
Sure. So ma'am, Mark Burrell from the Air Force. So since both of those places you mentioned are Air Force installations, what I would say is it is one of the three factors. So are there population centers there? Yes, that is a consideration. And even beyond that, are they sensitive receptors? By that, I mean, we are more concerned about schools, child development centers, those kinds of sensitive locations. But it's one of three considerations. The first is, what is the concentration and toxicity of the chemicals that we're talking about? And the second is, what is the migration and pathway to those receptors? So while it might be true that you're in a highly populated area, if there's no pathway for that chemical to get to the receptors that we're concerned about, the human or ecological receptors, then stand alone, because it's highly dense, doesn't mean it will be a high priority. If, however, all three of those come together and it's a highly toxic material and there's a pathway to receptors and there's a lot of receptors, then yes, that would be a factor. Thanks for the question, ma'am.
Thank you. What's a receptor?
A receptor would be, so a receptor would be a human, a person. And so is there a way for this contaminant to get into someone in our community, our airmen, our guardians, our families, or the community nearby? It can also be other receptors, animals, etc.
I would just mention that is not the purpose of this hearing, but just to let you know that many of our airmen who've been involved in the mechanical trades, repairing F-16s and A-7s and all the rest, many of them now have pulmonary lung disease, COPD. And I hope that the department is paying close attention to the facilities and the ventilation systems that these individuals who give their lives to this country work in. I think it's a serious problem, and you ought to look at your health outcomes. That's not your job directly. It happens elsewhere in the department, but it would be interesting to see how much we have to pay as a country in human lives, as well as the medical expenses associated with lung disease related to repairing this equipment. What about Two-Saint River? How do I get any response on what do we do with unexploded ordnance in the Great Lakes?
Is anyone?
Is there a map? Is there a map that defines that? And certainly for us in Ohio, how do we analyze the information that was collected nearly 2 decades ago where nothing's happened?
Ma'am, I've looked to my colleagues on our left and right. I think we're going to have to take that one for the record, and we'll get back to you with a more detailed response. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All have very important jobs. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. The committee looks forward to that information. Mr. Rolmack.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thanks to the witnesses. Mr. Kidd, Defense Department has a lot on its plate. And this question I'm going to ask is also, more at the 30,000 foot level, and it's about capacity. A lot of times, the things that we encounter from an environmental perspective rise out of neglect because we have to take resources, precious resources, and commit them elsewhere for other really important functions. So help me understand what kind of routine sort of infrastructure evaluations do you guys conduct to help inform leadership as to what I would call capacity issues? When we've got this capacity, which leads to my second question, and that is, if we have more capacity than what we need, and this is not necessarily designed to broach the subject of BRAC, but if we have excess capacity, how much is that costing us to take care of, as opposed to being able to use those resources to address some of the environmental concerns that have been raised in this hearing, or commit to other very important DoD functions?
So Congressman, yes, that is a pretty high level question. I think all of the services over time have indicated that we do have excess capacity in terms of infrastructure and facilities. In terms of whether or not we wish to have a BRAC or how much that is, I would suggest that we either take that for the record, or that we shift that question to those on our team that deal with real property and facilities.
Okay, the numbers I get, like Army's got like a third more capacity than it needs, Air Force about the same, maybe not as much on the Navy side. Would that be an accurate portrayal of where we are in capacity?
Sure, I'd have to take that one for the record. I mean, I've been in the room with conversations with the people who are smart on these type of issues, and I do know that the services all have gone on record saying that they do have excess capacity, but I wouldn't want to characterize the degree of that at this juncture without more research time, or to reach to our facilities experts.
Okay, my only other question is regarding cyber, and how protected our infrastructure is from a cybersecurity standpoint. Our country has been hit with certain hacks and what have you, and the susceptibility of our infrastructure is always a concern of mine. So, what national efforts are being made to identify the most at-risk installations and protect our critical installations from either a disruption or some degraded infrastructure in the surrounding area?
Congressman, thank you for that important question. Again, it's a little bit outside of the DERP, but it's sort of in all of our respective portfolios. The current national defense strategy is very clear. The homeland is no longer a sanctuary. Our adversaries have the capability to attack us, to spread disinformation, to take down many of our key and critical systems. We have a range of programs in the department to address this, and we have a range of interagency collaborative efforts with the Department of Energy, FEMA, and the White House in regards to key critical infrastructure. I took the same question last week from the Senate. We would be happy to come back and give you a more thorough briefing, but it's going to have to be at a different classification level than where we are today. Thank you.
Okay, and I also realize that we're having this hearing before we see the details on the budget. Are you concerned that there are going to, I kind of characterize it as a food fight over in the Pentagon, everybody competing for limited resources? Are you concerned that these resources are going to have to be redirected for other important operational and readiness sort of functions?
Sure. I think that the department, as mentioned earlier by one of the other members, the department has a lot on its plate and a lot of priorities. And I have significant trust in the senior leaders of the department to make those hard decisions about where resources are applied.
Good answer. Thank you so much. I yield back. And Madam Chair, I do have to scoot to another subcommittee. Thank you.
We're so glad you were able to join us for part of this. Mr. Quare,
Thank you, Madam Chair and Ranking Member, and to the witnesses. My question is.
Mr. Quare, we are having a hard time hearing you. Mr. Quare,
I
you're
will
not
call
coming
back
through.
again.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, thank you.
Mr. Kilmer, I'm going to go to you and then I'll go to Mr. Carter.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Mr. Ohanessian, as you know, there's 4 public Navy shipyards, and the chair mentioned this. All of them have legacy infrastructure dating back to the 19th and 20th centuries. So given that, the Navy released its Shipyard Infrastructure Optimization Program, or SIOP, which is a 20-year, $21 billion effort to revitalize and modernize our public shipyards. These modernization efforts are really critical to ensure our shipyards are resilient and ready to support our national security. And from what we've heard from the Navy, efforts will include upgrading and in some cases replacing dry docks, optimizing industrial processes, restoring facilities. Given the potential environmental impacts, how is the Navy effectively planning to ensure that the revitalization of our public shipyards takes into account environmental management considerations? You know, like so many Americans, I worry about the quality of the air we breathe and the water we drink. And I'd like to know what steps the Navy's taking to ensure that air and water quality aren't degraded during the PSYOP investments.
Thank you, Congressman, and it's good to see you again. And in addition to the specific piece that I mentioned before regarding environmental cleanup, you are quite correct. That's only a piece of what we're talking about when we think about the environmental planning piece writ large for the Shipyard Infrastructure Optimization Program. And because of the concerns that you mentioned and the importance of the early planning, we have in fact integrated the environmental planning piece of it into the overall planning piece for the program writ large. And that environmental planning not only has the cleanup, as I mentioned, and also protection of air and water, but other things as well. Conservation, natural resources, cultural resources, historical resources, tribal treaty rights. All of these come into play, and there are a lot of stakeholders that we work with, state historic preservation officers, tribes, non-governmental organizations, lots of stakeholders, and recognizing that we have in fact stepped forward and made sure that those planning processes, we get a jump on them and they're integrated into the overall process, because the last thing I want to do is to have my portfolio be the rate limiting factor on the important modernization effort for the 4 public shipyards. And we can talk more about that in a lot of detail separately, but overall, I would say we've jumped on it and made sure that we stay in the planning processes throughout.
Thank you. Let me shift gears. Mr. Kidd, you know, similar to a lot of towns across the country, the communities in my neck of the woods are unfortunately no strangers to the impacts of PFAS contamination. In 2020, groundwater in the community surrounding Naval Base Kitsap tested at dangerous levels for PFAS compounds. The Navy tested over 290 drinking water wells, with 83 wells showing some levels of PFAS, 2 wells containing an unsafe level of PFAS. That could affect over 2,000 homes in Kitsap County, Washington, with the impacted number of families likely to grow. This obviously is not just unique to my neck of the woods. That we were also seeing it at Joint Base Lewis McChord, where PFAS contaminants were detected on base, necessitating shutting down several drinking wells. JBLM also installed over $6 million worth of filtration equipment to keep PFAS contaminants from entering their on-base drinking water. So given the prevalence of PFAS contamination at communities surrounding bases around the country, does the DoD have enough funding for PFAS testing and remediation and mitigation efforts? And how does the DoD plan to keep folks, not just in my community, but others, in the loop so that they know they have safe drinking water for their families?
Sir, thanks for that question. As I heard it, you asked three questions. One about funding. You actually told a story about rapid response in regards to drinking water, and then about community engagement. Is that my breakdown of your,
Correct.
if I understand that? Also, I'd just like to tell you as an Oregonian and a one-time resident of Kitsap County, I'm familiar with that beautiful part of the country, and I have great fondness for that area. So first of all, your story about the response provided in terms of drinking water, the department has moved rapidly to address drinking water off base through the CERCLA process and on base where we have tested our installations. We've tested more than 500 installations, and we found 34 that needed some immediate removal action. And through the CERCLA process, we've identified 49 off-base sites where we were above the EPA health advisory level of 70 parts per trillion. In all cases, we reacted very quickly, sometimes measured in single-digit days, to provide drinking water to the affected communities. In terms of community engagement, this is very important. In my opening comments, I noted how important it is that we interact closely with the communities, both formally and informally. We support the Restoration Advisory Board process, providing technical assistance and support to the tune of about $2.5 million a year. In some cases, it's working very well. In others, not so well. And what we'd like to do is find the best practices in the department and sort of update the RAB handbook with a best practices guide. And I think we can do that in the coming months without too much trouble. So in terms of the funding requirements for PFAS, Congress has been very generous and has gotten us well down the road on this task. But just to try to, and it's complex, and some of my colleagues can jump in here because they build their budget requests from the service up. But right now, the majority of our effort is in investigating the problem, defining the scope and the nature of the problem, and going through that prioritization effort that we've all spoken about. Right now, we have enough funds. As we better define the problem, the scope of our cleanup responsibilities is likely to go up. So if I were to predict a funding pattern, it would probably be something kind of flatline for a next couple of years. And then as the information comes in, it will go up. And I defer to my colleagues since they actually build the budget requests if they want to jump in here.
We're going to have to move on, Mr. Kilmer, but great
Thanks, Madam
question. And water moves, so maybe you could let the committee know how you're going to continue to do testing because water continues to move. We have Mr. Carter, then Mr. Cuellar, if he's back on, and then Mr. Aguilar. Mr. Carter.
Can you hear me? Okay, good. The Military Munitions Response Program. This program is executed in a manner consistent with the budget request. Can you tell me what amount was actually executed for MMRP for FY20? Was it equal or above the level in the budget request? And how much FY20 projects were new starts and not modifications to existing awards?
Sir, I could probably answer that question if I flip through all the pages of my notebook, but if you don't mind, I'd like to take that one for the record and we can give you the exact numbers and response.
That's fine, that's fine. Can you give us, the subcommittee, any idea how the FY21 obligations and expenditures are looking to date?
Sir, I'm tracking that I can't give us an exact obligation rate for 2021 right now, but I believe we're generally on pathway for to be pretty close to what was fully appropriated at 1.9 billion across the whole program. Again, if I understand the question is what is our current obligation rate, and we'll take that one for the record.
Okay, Here's something I'm a little worried about. Munitions response requires specific expertise to execute cleanup of unexploded ordinances safely and efficiently. It's my understanding that the industrial base that the department relies upon to perform the cleanup and remediation at military munitions response program sites has undergone significant contraction over several years. I'm concerned that once the department does decide to accelerate cleanup of MMRP sites, the industrial base may longer have the talent and capacity to perform this vital work. What does the availability of workforce skilled in munitions response have in the department's ability to speed up or speed along cleanup? What are the main obstacles that exist to completing cleanup of military munitions? And are you concerned about the shrinking workforce? And what is your plan to remedy the situation?
I'll start with the Army's got the weakest piece. So Mark Rowe from the Air Force. So our munitions response program is pretty mature and in fact is much smaller than some of the other services. Where we stand right now is we have 181 open sites. We're about 87% complete. So we've only got about 13% more acreage to return. Some of the risk factors, so with MMRP, are the acute pieces of this, so the potential for a UXO, and obviously the constituents. The terrain can be a challenge, the technologies necessary, and then one of the big issues with MMRP is the cost of getting to negative. What I mean by that is regulators are unwilling, and rightly so, to accept anything other than 0% risk, 100% cleanup. And so getting to that can take some time to make sure that we've identified and defined that throughout the process. Doesn't mean we're not interested, but it's pretty far along, and we're now getting towards the end state of that. So I'm not sure that there's a lot to do to speed that up, but we'll work with the regulators where we can.
What about the workforce challenge that may be on the horizon?
So our at least from an Air Force perspective, our hope is we're 13% away from, we don't need to use that workforce as much anymore because we'll be complete with the things we know about. I've been to the NAOC conferences and talked to them. I understand what their concerns are. And so we'll continue to work with them to make sure that workforce is robust as it needs to be for the department.
Well, I've got a live fire range at Fort Hood. We're worried. We're very concerned about unexploded ordnance, and that's why I'm asking these questions. And I thank Madam Chairman. I'll yield back.
Madam Chair, maybe I can come in there and thank the judge in advance for taking over for me. I have to go to a pre-scheduled appointment.
Let's do it.
Thank you, Judge. Appreciate it.
We're in good hands with Judge Carter.
Right.
So could I ask?
For good hands.
So could I'd like the Army not to respond now, but to respond back written to Mr. Carter's question, because I believe it's my understanding from what I've read, you probably have the largest share of the unexploded ordnance out there. We heard from the Air Force, which has probably the least amount. And from what I'm learning, the Navy's is kind of underwater and not likely to be too terribly disturbed right now because they used to drop things before they came in to port during the war. So we like the Army to get back to us on that, your priority list and where you are on that. That's because it was an Army munitions site that got cleaned up in my district. So I want to know that from Mr. Carter. Mr. Cuellar, welcome back.
Thank you. The hazards of traveling. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank all the witnesses. And I also want to follow up with what Judge Carter mentioned. I also want to know, I think Texas has about 383 MMRP sites. Just want to know if there's any in my area, in the San Antonio area or in South Texas, if y'all can get back to us on that. And the second one, I guess it goes to the Assistant Secretary of the Air Force. And this has to do with the Defense Environmental Restoration. And Mr. Corral, I don't know if you were there some years ago when I was working with the San Antonio Waterworks, and they were trying to put a pipe to provide more water for the southern part of San Antonio and for the Lackland Air Force folks there. But we were told that it was an environmental hazard. So what they had to do was go around Lackland instead of going through, because they didn't want to disturb it. And so that caused, I think at the end, it was like $100 million. And so I want to know what's the latest on Lackland Air Force Base? Where is it on the priority? What are the next steps? And then, of course, on those munition cleanup programs sites that might be in my congressional district or area.
So thank you, Congressman Cuellar, and thanks for your help with SAWS. So you were the catalyst that got this to a solution at the former Lackland Air Force Base. So the challenge for the rest of the group was taking a water line through closed and capped environmental sites. So these were landfills that had long since been closed. With Congressman Cuellar's help, we were able to negotiate a deal with SAWS that took that line around the base. It did not end up costing them an additional $100 million. In exchange, the Air Force took over the infrastructure on Lackland Air Force Base and will ultimately take over the water infrastructure as well. This was the sewer line we were talking about. So we were able to solve that problem without creating an environmental problem. With regard to the existing, if you're referring to the PFAS, PFOA pieces of what's happening in Joint Base San Antonio in general, the data I have shows that at this point in time, we have no issues in San Antonio that require mitigation. We do have sites where we've identified that we'll ultimately have to do a remedial investigation. But as we discussed before, there aren't currently any pathways between those sites and any of the people or other receptors, as I call them, that are going to be impacted by PFAS. So we will get to cleaning that up. But the good news is there's no emergency need at this point in time. We'll take for record your MMRP question. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much. Anything on the other side from the Army?
Sir, we'll take for the record whether or not we have any MMRP sites located in your district, and we'll also look across and determine whether or not you have any FUD sites and where those are located, and we'll get back to you with that list.
All right, thank you. Well, I want to thank.
For the record, would you explain what a FUD site is? I won't take that away from your time, Mr. Cuellar. Please explain. I know what a FUD site is, but.
Yes, so a FUD site is a formerly used defense site, and this is a piece of property that was underneath the jurisdiction of the Secretary of Defense or the Defense Department and was transferred out of our jurisdiction before October of 1986. And so they're properties that are no longer underneath our jurisdiction.
All right, thank you. Well, I want to thank all of you. I know it takes a lot of money to do this type of work, but I just want to say thank you so much. And we'll follow up with the questions that I had, but thank you so much to all of you. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you. We look forward to that list from the Army. Mr. Aguilar, then Ms. Kilpatrick, Mr. Christ, and Mr. Ryan. Mr. Aguilar.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to the panel. Just a couple questions. Ms. Borman, in your written testimony, you noted that 91% of your projects have reached the restoration complete milestone, and that there were a remaining 1,200 sites that have yet to reach that milestone. I just kind of wanted to wrap my head around, how you categorize the remaining projects. More specifically, are the remaining projects more complex than the 91%? Are these newly identified sites, or do they present similar remediation challenges?
Yes, thank you for the question. So the remaining 1,200 sites that we have, approximately 83% of those are installation sites. The other 17 are related to military munitions. And these are our most complex sites. And what I mean by this is they could be groundwater sites where we are still in the process of trying to track where the groundwater is going. They could be complex sites from the mixture of chemicals that are in the groundwater that had been used and that In some cases, we may not yet have the technology available to properly remediate those. But of the 1,200 sites that we do have, a little over 400 of those are already in some sort of monitoring or remedial action, have some sort of remedial action ongoing. And we are in the investigation process of the remaining sites.
But it's fair to say that of the remaining sites, so those are going to be more labor intensive, more costly, longer time horizons. And as you mentioned, sometimes we're going to need help from the technology side that may not be there yet.
That is correct, yes.
Okay, I appreciate it. Mr. Ohanessian, the Navy's Environmental Restoration Program leverages DoD's relevant frameworks, either the Relative Risk Site Evaluation Framework or the Munitions Response Site Prioritization Protocol, to prioritize projects by those that present the greatest risk to human health and safety. Can you share how the Environmental Restoration Program coordinates with EPA to prioritize the cleanup of the remaining sites?
Yes, sir. So at each of the locations where we have work going on, we do work with our regulatory partners. That's the EPA, but often also state regulatory agencies. And the public has input as well. So together we figure out what is the plan going forward to work on for the next year, next 2 years, and so forth. And so the risk piece of it comes into play, not just amongst ourselves within the Department of the Navy, but with the regulators as well. And then we lay out what can we work on collectively as much as we can. And then that gets rolled up into our programming and ultimately our budget request in the president's budget.
Are there cases when there's, some conflict between the EPA and what you folks are doing, and how do you resolve that?
I can't. Of course, there's interagency coordination and there's a back and forth, but I don't recall an instance where we were not on the same page as far as what work to work on next and where to ask for the funding.
So from a prioritization standpoint, you feel that things have been in sync with the EPA, coordination and partnership?
Yes.
Okay, I appreciate that. Madam Chair, I'll yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Kirkpatrick.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you so much for having this hearing. I really appreciate it. My question is for Mr. Correll. I represent a district in southern Arizona that's home to Davis-Monthan Air Force Base and neighbor Morris Air National Guard Base at Tucson International Airport. A large portion of my district resides in an EPA-designated sole source aquifer and closed basin water system. In these systems, the watershed does not have an active surface water connection to an ocean where contamination can move out of the community. PFAS contaminants have been found in production wells above the safe level near Davis-Monthan and threaten primary and backup sources of drinking water. The spread of contaminants has been initially mitigated thanks to the rapid actions of the city's water department. However, this has come at a significant financial cost to the city, and 24 wells have been either completely shut down or placed in a restricted use status. The city is bearing the brunt of the effort to protect over 700,000 residents. How does the Department of the Air Force account for different types of water systems when evaluating priorities for remediation? Do you account for closed water systems and sole source aquifers? How is the Air Force supporting local municipalities who need to protect their citizens' drinking water while they wait for the department to run its often lengthy process? How do you balance the risk of contaminants spreading from non-drinking water to drinking water? Mr. Correll, in your testimony, you stated that the Air Force and your partners are at capacity with how much funding you can execute. This is a concerning statement as PFAS only becomes a larger problem. What resources do you need to overcome this capacity issue?
Thank you,
I'll
Congresswoman.
yield back.
Thank you, Congresswoman. So I've had the opportunity to meet with the mayor of Tucson, and so we've had this discussion personally, and so I am very familiar with the issues there. There's two parts to how we respond to any of these, but particularly at Tucson, as you're interested in. The first is what we call an interim removal action. So what we're looking for there is, how do we make sure, where we've been the cause, that we make sure we are able to keep folks from drinking water above the EPA health advisory today. And that comes from support to the city as well as to individual private well owners with regard to either bottled water, filtration systems and the like. And so we are doing that in that area today. Longer term, the answer, you asked about whether or not we consider the fact that it's a sole source aquifer, and the answer is yes, that is a consideration as we talk about what's the level of toxicity, what are the chances, the speed and movement and migration potential for contaminants in your water supply. If it's such that it's not going to go anywhere, that can be bad, as it is you're talking about, where it's a sole water source, then yes, that would be a consideration as well in terms of what are the pathways. If it's the sole pathway, then yes, that's going to put it higher on the priority list. Our environmental folks at the Air Force Civil Engineer Center look at and create what's called a program requirements document every year. So they're looking at what is the data at each one of these sites so that we can help decide which ones do we need to do first and which ones do we need to do next. Now, what I'll tell you in terms of resources is our first priority, as I mentioned, is make sure nobody's drinking water above the health advisory level. Once we get to that, then we're going to take a little more measured approach to make that happen. We can make that measured approach go faster, but it doesn't mean anyone's necessarily safer. As we go through the full circle process, we will identify those migration pathways. And if we do, then we'll take the next piece, which we call an interim remedial action, which where we may put in a pump and treat system or something else to keep that from moving as we identify it going forward. It's a very robust process. It is time consuming, and I know that frustrates some folks, but we are working through that at Tucson and other locations. I thank you for the question.
Thank you, Mr. Correll. Thank you so much. And thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. I'm going to use my prerogative and do a tag-on question. So in Minnesota, our Department of Natural Resources, we know how the water flows. We know what it's going. So what do you mean when you say you're researching how plumes of water are flowing underground? I mean, I don't know Arizona, but I'm assuming you're working with the states on this because the states usually have all this in their inventory of water. So you wouldn't have to reinvent the wheel.
So actually, ma'am, they have some information, but when we go through the remedial investigation process, that's where we actually have to look at on a site-specific basis exactly what's going on. So not to get too geeky here, but we talk about stratigraphy, hydrology, where does the water move, paleo channels, there's ancient rivers underneath. And
No,
detail's not available when we find that out.
Okay, so sometimes you don't have everything you need, is what you're saying, so you have to do more.
Correct.
Okay, because I have, as I said, I have water being filtrated to take a lot of different chemicals out. So I have a municipal system that's being filtered that had, that was part of the FUDs. And then on the reclaimed land that got returned over from GSA, we have filtration on it, closed cycle for the life of the planet. So I knew what you were talking about, Ms. Kilpatrick, and you have my support to see what we can do to have things done. Mr. Christ and then Mr. Ryan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I've seen reports that 2/3 of critical military installations are threatened by climate change. Please tell me how challenges associated with climate change, such as sea level rise and increased flooding risk, are impacting the Defense Environmental Restoration Program? And are you all actively tracking climate threats on a facility by facility level? Thank you.
Sir, the department recognizes the reality of climate change and the threat that it poses to our mission, and particularly to our installations and the services that those installations provide, not only to our service members, but to the surrounding communities. At the end of April, we published the Defense Climate Assessment Tool findings, which basically have taken an installation level assessment of 1,400 installations at the United States and overseas about the effects of climate change across 8 areas, 2 time scenarios, 2 time frames, and 2 emissions scenarios. That is the first order, sort of the first level in an analytic process that will eventually distill down to and include a variety of site-specific details and models, to include areas where we have installation or munitions response sites.
Anyone else?
Sure. Adding to that, the cleanup, just going to the cleanup piece of it, the cleanup process does have a built-in feature of always monitoring and revisiting to address changing conditions. And so climate change would be a changing condition that we would see and react to as necessary. But fortunately, the process has that in there already, and we're able to respond if we see something happening.
Thank you. And then what proactive approaches should we be considering when forecasting future mitigation and restoration needs, especially as it relates to our work as appropriators?
Sir, so the climate change assessment modeling that the department is doing, along with other agencies in the federal government, will allow us to model the predictive future effects of climate change and extreme weather on our installations. We are then going to have to make some decisions with what we do with that information. And, you know, it could be sort of defend, abandon, or adapt. And I think the department's approach is adaptation across all the systems within the organization. This week, we will send our draft climate adaptation plan to the White House, and pending on that review, it should be made public within the next 30 to 60 days. And that will start to give you a sense and feel for some of these activities. But this is a multi-decade challenge of both adaptation and mitigation, and it's too early to predict where we're going to end up. But we recognize the reality of the problem. We're investing in the decision tools, analytics, and workforce that will be needed to answer the very tough questions like the ones you just posed.
Okay, thank you. And then finally, what are the scientific and technological challenges in completing the remediation of these sites, and what research and development is needed to improve effectiveness or lower cost?
Sir, are you speaking to all sites or to PFAS sites?
All sites.
Sure, I would just say we do have a robust research and development program in the department through the ESTCP and CERTIP activities. There's also pathways for new technologies to come into the cleanup process as part of CERCLA, and I'll let my colleagues jump in here if they want to add anything.
So thank you. I think, at least from my perspective, not necessarily Department of the Air Force, is what I would like to see is more of, and I think Chair McCollum mentioned this a little bit, is if we can get more of what we call in situ, in the ground technologies, as opposed to having to bring the contaminant out, mitigate it, and then either dispose of it or put something back in. That's an area where we'd love to see technology improve.
Great. Thank you very much. And thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. We have time to do some more questions. I know there's members who are still Their names are still on the screen, but they're not on the screen. I'm going to ask Mr. Carter if he has another question. If you want to ask another question, please turn your camera on. Other than that, I have some questions to close up. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter, oh, they're fixing your mic. There you go.
Are we good?
We're good. I can hear you.
Okay. I hate to keep getting back to the unexpended ordinances. But traditionally, the funding provided for the to request in formerly used defense sites amount is applied to military munitions response program. Mr. Kidd, do you plan to use this approaching of increases in the same manner? Or did you understand the question?
No, sir, I understood the question. The short answer is yes. We'll keep the same process. For FUD specific, as you know, the Army is the executing agent. Ms. Bourne, do you have anything you want to add?
No, so
All right, you know, kind of changing my position a little bit, but one of the questions I've wondered, because I can remember several times we've had this question come up in past years about cleaning up sites. When you start remediating a site, does the department and the services commit to seeing the project through all at once, or if another site were to emerge with a higher risk, could an ongoing project be put on the back burner? And what is the process for evaluating the need to shift resources, and how is it done?
This is an execution question.
So I'll start for the Air Force and tell you the answer to your first question is yes. If a higher risk site comes up, then we will put others on the back burner to address that higher risk. How is that done? It's done at the Air Force Civil Engineer Center. They do what's called a program review document. That program review document consists of a senior review team that meets 16 different times during the course of the year to evaluate all the regions and sites and assigns a risk of either 4, which is high, or 1, which is low, or somewhere in between. They then evaluate what they think those risks are. Now, for IRP or MMRP, there are slightly different risks. We've talked about what the relative risk is, and we've talked a little bit about the UXO versus constituent piece that's in the MMRP, but it's all part of the cleanup program. So they'll evaluate those. It's not like, if something's slightly worse, we're all of a sudden going to stop investing. So there will be some consideration in that. But if a significantly worse project comes into play, we're going to put that ahead, and we'll use that process to get there.
And what kind of schedule would you have to get back to the projects that you pull off of?
So again, that's going to be, so on an annual basis, we're going to look at these. When we pull off, so I would not characterize it as pulling off. So generally speaking, we're going to award a contract. We're going to finish the contracts that are under. So the notion that we would just completely stop at a site, unlikely. More likely, we would de-emphasize it. We would slow it down so that we could shift resources over to the higher priority. Not likely that we would just stop it there.
Well, I can recall some of our colleagues from California complaining that you'd pulled off of some of the sites of the closed bases there and had taken a joke at an act of Congress to get you back on there. And so I just wanted to know that if there's a timetable that you try to stick to.
Well said, and I think well delivered, Mr. Carter.
Okay, thank you.
Very, because I'm going to do a follow-up written question for the record on the same thing. Ms. Capter.
Thank you, Madam Chair, very much. And again, thank our witnesses. I think many of us hope that with your testimony today and looking toward the future to build back better, that defense environmental cleanup might well be a part of future bills that we consider in addition to the annual appropriations bill. I just wanted to show you a map. I don't know if this is going to be very clear or not, but this is a map of the Great Lakes region, and actually it has colors on it that indicate levels of stress I come from one of the most stressed of all the Great Lakes, Lake Erie, and Lake Ontario is more stressed than our lake. I am wondering, in terms of the work you do, whether you have similar national mapping you can make available to the committee, indicating from worst to best, different coasts, different parts of the country, in terms of the contaminants and environmental degradation that you deal with every day, to make it more understandable to us, so that we can get a sense nationally of where the stress is greatest in the different types of cleanups that you face. Do you have that kind of very strategic mapping to give clarity to this issue for members of this subcommittee and other members of Congress as well?
So for the Navy, I would say we do not have it depicted on a map format, no.
I'm not.
Wow.
aware for the Air Force either.
I'm not aware for the Army either.
What would one have to do in order to give clarity to this issue in terms of mapping, so we could understand the whole of it, not just little parts here and there? What would it take?
So, Madam Congresswoman, the power of GIS information is very compelling, and we've seen it used to great effect. Basically, what you're asking for is a multi-layered GIS website where you could introduce a range of different information that could be graphically portrayed so that users could pull up where a PFAS site might be or where a munitions response site might be. I mean, it's certainly within the realm of the possible. It would be an extensive amount of work required to get there. But I understand the potential and what you're asking for.
Yes, we'd like to help you. And I think greater clarity helps delivering results. And we're sort of in a murky, I feel murky right now. And, we have had this challenge in other areas. So I encourage you to give me a budget estimate of what it would cost or who we go to get this done and done well for the sake of the country. And whether you would do it or other agencies of the government, the private sector, give us a sense of the cost.
And we'll certainly take that one for the record, and we can build a cost estimate of a comprehensive GIS portrayal of the department's environmental response program.
Yes, and I'm going over time, but just to say, I'd like to know if my area, are we medium bad? Are we minimally bad? Are we horrible compared to other places in the country based on the material content that's contaminated? That's really important for us to know.
I think they heard you. And
No, we heard you. I was just looking at the red light that's on my screen, so I wasn't going to take any more of your time. So, but again, I mean, I certainly understand the value of a picture and how a picture is worth 1,000 words. And in another lifetime and in another career, I cleared ordnance for the State Department. I ran our international overseas ordnance program, and the power of a map was very compelling, as it told people where they could go and where they couldn't go, and how they could safely deliver humanitarian response. So I understand the power of a map.
so, Mr. Carter, with your permission, I'm going to lay out. We've got feedback.
Go ahead.
I'm going to lay out questions, some questions for the record on here, and then I do have a few follow-ups I'm going to ask.
That sounds great. Thank
Okay.
you.
So for the record, I'm going to be asking for some information on how tribes are addressed on this issue for prioritizing and mitigation for activities on tribal lands and how you engage with them. We know you engage with states and local governments, but we have nation to nation obligations with our tribes. I'm also going to be submitting for the record, FY21 had an increase of $20 million was provided to the Office of the Deputy Assistant for Environment to address your workload. And we're going to be asking if you're going to need more than that based on PFAS. We don't have the president's budget in front of us, of course, and some of those answers might be in there, but we're going to be asking you about staffing and if you have adequate staffing. We're going to, one of the things I think that you've heard from the members here, and there was a lot of engagement, a lot of people stayed on listening, even though they didn't have another question. We're going to ask each one of you how COVID also impacted your restoration projects, if you were able to obligate all your funding as you expected, or maybe you can answer that yes or no right now. But if you can't, you can get back to us. Do you know if you were able to obligate?
Yes.
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 Yes, okay. So that's good to know. I would like to, and these are more if you could answer now. After 30 years, so in 2017, after 30 years of president, the DoD General Counsel changed its position and concluded that the Air National Guard could no longer use Defense Environmental Restoration Account, DERA, to pay for environmental cleanup because it did not meet the legal definition of owner or operator of the most affected Air National Guard bases. In subsequent years, the NDAA has sought to create clarity on this issue and allow for the Guard to access DERA funding. But it's not clear the department feels that this issue has been resolved. Mr. Kidd, is the Guard currently able to access Defense and Environmental Restoration Account funding, or are they still restricted?
Man, they're able to access it for PFAS issues.
For PFAS.
So there's actually a little more to that. So
Okay, thanks.
So what the recent legislation did was set for PFAS and PFOA that it would fall under the DERP or under the DERA program. However, some of our guard locations are former active locations. So there's also an aspect of if contamination occurred when the installation was active. So let's say we have Ohio, for example, Rickenbacker National Guard Base used to be Lockbourne Air Force Base. If the contamination occurred when it was active, then it can still be eligible for DERA. So it's not just for PFAS and PFOA, but it depends on the status of the location.
We're going to follow up and maybe or have the authorizers follow up if we need to make sure that that doesn't ping pong back and forth, that there's clarity on that moving forward if we need to do anything legislatively, so we don't have another council change of position. So I'm going to go back to the installation restoration program prioritization. So the Department of Defense, under your installation restoration program, you address contaminants from hazardous substance, pollutants at installations. Base realignment enclosures are under BRAC. So you've got all these different categories that you go under. But as a total, as of September 2019, DoD identified over 34,000 IRP sites that may require cleanup. Could you tell me if the projects that are receiving the environmental restoration funding, are they evaluated and prioritized in a fiscal year? Is there a list of projects that shift in priority? Because I think we've heard that from you a little bit, that something kind of rises to the top. How often does that happen and reevaluated? And how do you resequence projects? If you don't, you can take that for the record, but I think you've heard that from a lot of members, what's happening here, especially if you've started working with a contractor or let a contract, and then all of a sudden you kind of put stuff on pause. That contractor has, with that contract, done a business plan after it, and so how do you synchronize that? And do you have an estimated cost for the complete cleanup for the installation restoration program? Another section that I'd like to touch on is Congress has been appropriating funding for the environmental restoration accounts above budget requests, and the general department and services have been able to fully obligate the funding in the fiscal years it was appropriated. So could you tell us, and we'll put this in writing for you, how the requested amount was determined for the fiscal year? And is the request based on work that can be completed in that fiscal year? Or are the services getting environmental restoration funding that they're requesting through the department as part of a budget formulation? So we want to understand the breakdown of how you're obligating these dollars a little bit. Another question is, and this goes back again, the higher risk issue on it is something that keeps coming up time and time again in questions from members and from staff, because we want to do some oversight to see how we're moving forward on that on it. And we'd like it to be a little more transparent. And then you mentioned your participation in with communities. So if you've engaged the community that you're going to clean something up, or you've informed Congress that you're going to clean something up, and then something rises to the top, do you have to go back and disengage the community and say, well, just put it on hold? What do you do after you've had community processes, especially after you've identified a source, whether it's unexploded ordnance, whether it's PFAS, whether it's something else? You've engaged the community, you told the community you're going to clean it up, you've let the contracts, you're going to finish it, right, in a timely fashion?
So as I mentioned before, contracts we have awarded, we're not going to cancel them and stop them. We may have to divert resources to a higher priority. And again, our priorities are high, medium, and low.
Excuse me, I'm having a hard time understanding that. You're not going to cancel them, but you're going to reprioritize other projects. Mr. Carter's agreeing with me.
So when I say, reprioritize, so it's high, medium, and low. So what could happen is I could have some number in the high category, some in the medium, some in the low. We're planning to work on a medium one, another one comes in, it's high, we're going to go after that high one. Doesn't mean the high one's going to stop. It means some of these others are going to slow down.
But you've let a contract, you've engaged the community, you've told the taxpayers that you're going to clean this up, and you've kind of given them a time frame, right? And you've actually gone out and solicited contracts. So now business has made their business plan based on that contract, and you're saying you could slow that down. So when you're slowing it down, 6 months, a year, 3 years, 5 years?
So in your question for record, you've asked for us to give you the specifics. So I'd
Yeah.
like to do that as part of the specifics.
We would love that. We'd love that for not just the Air Force, but for others as well too. And so that goes to the question. So then how long does a typical cleanup take? And what kind of constraints land up being in the cleanup process? And as you said, something all of a sudden, if it's a life, health, safe emergency, I think everybody would understand that rising to the top for something, but we want to know, what's going on. So, and how do you work with state and local regulators? I know in an area that we just worked with the Army on Round Lake, it took us 10 years working with state agencies and with local regulators, including the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. What's your average time frame on things like this? If somebody's saying, no, we want it done our way, and you go into negotiations on someone on cleanup, I think letting something stay open, and this isn't on any of you in particular, for 10 years is kind of, well, I'm from the federal government, and I don't want to say it takes us 10 years to make a decision on how we're going to clean something up when we know it has to be cleaned up. So on that. And then I think the workforce issue is important all around as you're staffing up and doing more. Are you anticipating having problems with being able to find contractors and workforce on that? So we'll give you those for the record, but this was our first hearing on this, and I just want to thank you all for your professionalism. I want to thank you all for the work that you do behind the scenes. You are all very dedicated to doing the very best you can with the resources that you have. Everybody can tell your sincerity about wanting to get this done, but we also have an oversight responsibility, and we have to, report back to the taxpayer. And as you know, PFAS is important, but it's not important to the point where people don't want, the munitions looked at. So how do we make sure that we're moving progressively forward and we don't put one problem so high up on the list that communities don't see other issues being addressed, and we just, for back of a letter term, we just let them sit there. And I think Mr. Christ, with climate change and everything like that too, now you have a whole new portfolio that you're looking at with risk. So I sincerely mean, and I think I speak on behalf of the committee, we really do appreciate the job that you do. Usually we see people wearing uniforms and it's a very different kind of discussion, but you're the life, health, and safety for our service members and for our communities and for future generation and protecting the environment. And those are very important jobs. And for that, we thank you for doing that. So we look forward to seeing the budget, working with you in partnership to get as much of this cleaned up as fast as we can get it cleaned up, and hopefully even work to not have as much contamination in the future. So Mr. Carter, with that, unless you have anything you want to add, I'm going to adjourn the meeting.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and I want to commend you for going into this very important subject. It's about time we got into this and stay on top of it, and because we are all concerned. And I do thank everybody involved in a mind-bending challenge, but I think you can do it, and I commend you for trying. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
So as we go into Memorial Day, we remember those who died in service to this country, but we thank those like yourself who are working to make our environment safer. So thank you very much. And with that, this meeting is adjourned.